In the last video of the perspective series, we talked about creating complex forms. In this video, we're going to try to transition from complex forms into creating actual vehicles. I'm going to present three basic exercises in this video for you guys to do. The first exercise is going to focus on ellipses. This is going to help you when you're constructing wheels. The second exercise is going to focus on navigating through forms using that three-plane technique from the last video. And the third exercise will focus on simplifying vehicle forms into basic primitive shapes. At the end, we're going to bring it all together in a time-lapse demo that will construct an actual military vehicle. Here's some examples of some military vehicle studies I've done in the past. And once you guys have kind of internalized this information, you should be able to go and do military vehicles just like this from photo reference or even from life if you can find it. All right, with all that stuff out of the way, let's go ahead and get started. Here's an exercise you can do to get more comfortable with ellipses. First, create a box. Be very careful when you create this box because the width of it will determine your degree. Degree is just a fancy word for the width of your ellipse. But width is really important when it comes to ellipses. If you get this wrong, you'll end up with a really weird looking vehicle. Here's an example of one that I drew about a year ago, and as you can see, it just looks off. These wheels are too thin. The degree of the ellipse is too small, and it doesn't fit the actual perspective of the vehicle. Because of this, it looks like these wheels aren't actually round. The best way to really get better at this is to draw vehicles from life. By observing ellipses in real life and trying to figure out what they look like on paper, you'll get a better and better eye for trying to figure out what the proper degree is for the proper angle. Your second step will be to find the midpoints of this plane. So I just use a simple box division technique to find the midpoint on each side of this square plane. Your third step is to find the minor axis. Now the minor axis, I think of this as the axle of your vehicle. If you're drawing a wheel, this is the point that the wheel will rotate around. This is your axle. And so to find this, I just dropped a plane in, found the center of that plane, and then there's my minor axis. So you can imagine if this was a wheel, that would be the axle. The important thing to note about the minor axis is it should perfectly cut your ellipse in half. Step 4 is to drop in your ellipse. In order to do this, we're going to make the ellipse touch each one of the midpoints that we found earlier, while also thinking about the minor axis and about how that minor axis should perfectly cut that ellipse in half. Now let's look at a time lapse of all of these steps put together. A great way to develop this skill is to fill a page with boxes in random orientations, then go back and try to place ellipses on those boxes. Ellipses are difficult, and learning them is a big step. If you're still confused, check out James's Perspective 3 video and dig into Scott Robertson's book some more. Consider these properties next time you're looking at a car in real life. Move around it and look at how the ellipses change as you change your perspective. In the picture on the right, notice how the wheel in the back has a much smaller degree than the wheel in the front, which appears to be much wider. Notice how each one can be perfectly cut in half by the wheel axle, otherwise known as the minor axis. All of these things should be considered when drawing vehicles from life, and the more you try to draw vehicles from life, the better you're going to get at creating ellipses. Now we're going to use the material from the first video in this series to do an exercise where we construct some generic vehicle forms. Recall how we made a ground plane, mid-plane, and modeling plane to make complex forms. We looked at a few breakdowns like this already last week, and here I'm just doing the same thing I did then. I'm visually finding the ground plane, and then I'm just creating a silhouette that I feel represents the mid-plane well. Once we have this information, we can rotate it in any perspective angle that we want. Here I have two setups with ground planes and mid-planes. All I need to do is extract the form creating modeling planes by mapping it out. Doing this is almost reminiscent of those XY coordinate graphs for math class. If you lose your place, just remember to go back to the midplane and branch out from there. Usually I do one side first and then transfer over to the other side. If you're having trouble with this step, go back and practice part 1 in the series a few more times. Okay, now we're going to get really fancy. I want to place the turret of this tank on top of my current form. I've created a quick study of the turret in the bottom left. As you can see, I've already plotted the midplane out in purple. Next, I'm going to plot the ground plane in blue. As I add in the modeling planes, I'm going to number them. This will help me keep track of it later. All the information's there now. All we need to do is carefully follow our lines and create modeling planes. There's going to be a lot of lines on the paper. Try to focus on doing one set at a time. This skill will take time and practice to develop. It's incredibly frustrating at first, but it does get easier. Remember, if you get lost, just go back to your midplane and try to find your location. Think about one modeling plane at a time. Don't get impatient and start guessing. Once these modeling planes are finally mapped out, we can fill in the overall silhouette of our object. This next exercise is much easier and it's more akin to something that Peter Han or Kim Jong-gi might do. It's very easy to do with military vehicles, but it gets a bit trickier with more modern vehicles. Basically, you want to think about everything in basic primitive forms. Look at the vehicle and try to break it down into shapes. Don't worry about detail, just go for big, simple forms. Practice doing simple modifications to these forms by adding on or subtracting away from them. Now let's do one of these without tracing over. Try rotating this in your mind as well. Break it into those primitive forms and then rotate it around to different angles and see if you can draw it still. Finally, we are going to combine what we practiced in all three of these exercises. The ellipses will help us construct a wheel. The three-plane style of construction will help us navigate and measure with ease. and the Kim Jung-gi form practice will help us make everything less complex and more efficient. I get a baseline first by laying down primitive forms. As I go through this, notice how I'm pulling techniques from the 3-plane modeling system. I can navigate to any point within this object with ease because I've already done more complex constructions than this. You should really start to feel like you are the boss of the object rather than at its mercy. This drawing took me about a half an hour in real time. More detailed ones might take longer. Don't try to rush yourself. Speed will come with patience. You can have as little or as much construction as you would like. I suggest doing some drawings with incredibly heavy construction like this, and some drawings with a little bit more restrained construction like this. Both will help you improve in their own ways. Think about this construction phase as your kind of time to freestyle. I don't want you to copy exactly what I'm doing. I want you to be so familiar with the rules that we talked about previously that you can just kind of do your own thing. If you're having trouble with this, it just means you haven't practiced all the previous exercises enough. At this point, I feel like I'm pretty happy with the construction. With my construction finished, I can knock down the opacity and start doing my final line work. If I was doing this traditionally, I would either do the initial construction in light Copic marker, or I would just use a very light line with ballpoint. Both ways produce different visual results, and I think you should experiment to see which one you like. To make perfect wheels, I'm using the ellipse marquee tool in Photoshop. I make a general ellipse shape, and then I go to Edit, Stroke, and I pick 2 to 3 pixels. Next, I just take my lasso tool and I arrange this to fit it within my boxes in my construction, paying attention to those rules of ellipses. It's really easy once you get the hang of it. When doing this traditionally, I would either freehand these ellipses or I would just use an ellipse guide. Don't get too caught up in making your wheels completely perfect yet. I'm thinking in the future we could maybe have a video entirely on wheels because I have a lot of tips and tricks for making these. For now, just worry about getting those ellipses right and the general shape. I'll also make sure to talk more extensively about this in my Gumroad. This step just takes patience and careful observation. If your underdrawing is good, you should be able to execute this just fine. If you enjoyed this lesson and would like more, I've made an accompanying Gumroad on drawing military vehicles. Keeping these a reasonable length for YouTube is really difficult because of how much information there is to cover. On Gumroad, I can really elaborate and go through some real-time examples, so check it out if that sounds interesting to you. It's linked in the description below. And that's all for this video. Next time we're going to work on transferring from big boxy military vehicles to antique cars and Jeeps. Also, make sure to subscribe to the channel. James has a lot of really cool stuff planned, and there's going to be content coming out very regularly. See you guys next time.